Good afternoon. My name is Amy Burkert, and I'm the Vice Provost for Education here at Carnegie Mellon. I'm delighted to welcome all of you in the room today who has joined us, and also those watching via live stream, to this inaugural lecture of the new Presidential Distinguished Lecturer Series. As we all know, only part of the educational experience at a university occurs within the confines of the traditional classroom course-based learning setting. Public lectures shared by thought leaders and innovators, discussions addressing key issues facing the global society, as well as engagement efforts focused on community transformation, also contribute to a deep and vibrant university experience. Our president, Subra Suresh, himself a recognized thought leader and global citizen, has established this new series as part of his commitment to enhancing the CMU experience for all. There is a new page for the series on the Presidential Leadership website, and recordings of this lecture and all subsequent lectures will be made available there. It is now my honor to welcome Carnegie Mellon's 9th president, Dr. Subra Suresh, to the stage to officially launch the series and to introduce our inaugural lecturer.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much to all of you for coming here. I couldn't have asked for a better speaker for the inaugural lecture than my good friend, Carlos Moedas. When we thought of this some time ago, I had the pleasure of seeing him earlier this year at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and we had an opportunity to chat. And I thought it'll be a great way to launch the series with this inaugural lecture. About a couple of months ago, I called him up and asked him when he was likely to come and visit us. And he was so gracious, given his extraordinarily busy schedule. And he said, "Tell me when you want me to come." And he and his colleagues from Brussels, they traveled yesterday on Easter Sunday to be here with us. So I'm most grateful to him and to all of my friends and colleagues from the European Commission and ERC who are here with us today. They had a great time visiting with faculty and staff at the university, talking about a number of different topics. This lecture series is designed to invite a couple of distinguished speakers every year to the campus so that the campus community will have an opportunity to engage with them and to hear their perspectives. We already have a speaker lined up for the fall semester, and I won't reveal her name yet, so it'll be my hope is that it'll be a very exciting series. The idea would be, we get often, especially in the current political climate, we get American perspectives, we get local perspectives. It is equally important that we get perspectives from the other side of the ocean. And oftentimes, they inform us in ways in which local perspectives don't necessarily inform us. Carlos Moedas is the current Commissioner for Research, Science, and Innovation for the European Commission. If I want to draw an analogy to his job in the American context, that'll be equivalent to the science advisor to the President of the United States. And you had an opportunity to meet Dr. John Holdren, who served as the previous science advisor to President Obama, who came to campus and spoke at least on a couple of different occasions in the last few years. Currently, there is that position is vacant, and as a result, I'm doubly pleased to have Carlos visit us today. He proposes legislation, implements policy, and manages business of the European Union. If you go to Wikipedia and type in his name or do a Google search for Wikipedia, it'll say he's a Portuguese banker and politician. But the Carlos that I know is a deep intellectual, a scientist at heart, and an engineer by training. He received his undergraduate degree in civil engineering from Lisbon University in 1993. Following that, he worked at the Suez Group in France from 1993 to 1998. Then he joined Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to receive an MBA. Following that, he worked for Goldman Sachs in mergers and acquisitions. Then he returned to Portugal in 2004. And then in 2008, he set up his own investment management company called the Crimson Investment Management. According to Wikipedia, and I don't know if the year is correct, but it probably is, in 1995, Carlos was elected to the Portuguese Parliament. In 2011, the Prime Minister of Portugal appointed him as the Under-Secretary of State. In 2014, Prime Minister also nominated him to the European Commission. So I just learned how this process works. There are 28 countries of the European Union, which may become 27 after Article 50 is implemented. There are 28 members, each representing the country, and Carlos represents Portugal. And they serve in that capacity, not just representing their own countries, but they represent the European Union. And he represents, for the European Union, research, science, and innovation. And this position was approved by the European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, in 2014. So that's sort of his current affiliation. It's a very influential position. As the manager of Horizon 2020, it's one of the most important global funds for science and innovation. He has interacted with hundreds of research, education, and innovation projects. These projects include data solutions to improve transportation mobility, advanced robotics, understanding cancer progress to improve treatment options, and of course, funding research all across Europe. I'm sure to you this sounds very familiar. Today, we are honored to have him reflect on globalization, the uneven growth in productivity, and the need for global education systems to adapt to the resulting skill gaps. I would also like to point out that accompanying Carlos is Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, who is a mathematician by training. He's currently the president of the European Research Council, or ERC. The European Research Council is the European counterpart to the National Science Foundation. So I've had the pleasure in my previous job of not only knowing Jean-Pierre when he was newly appointed to his position, but equally his predecessor, Helga Nowotny from Austria, with whom I had the pleasure of working as well. Tomorrow, Jean-Pierre will give the Simon Distinguished Lecture, and the announcement for that has already come your way. So with that introduction, let me please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Commissioner Carlos Moedas. Carlos.
Thank you so much, President Suresh. Dear Subra, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. Thank you very much for your friendship and your engagement with Europe and the world. As a president of an American university, you have been a friend of us in Europe, and you've just mentioned Jean-Pierre. And I also like to mention Jean-Pierre is the president of the European Research Council, a 13 billion euro project for fundamental science and the jewel of the crown of our programs. And it's really a fantastic opportunity and a unique opportunity to be in this amazing world-class institution. It's not every day that you are invited to be the guest speaker in such an amazing place. So I'm very honored to be here. And you asked me, Subra, to talk about the future-proofing of our educational systems. And I was kind of puzzled that you asked me that, but I was very honored, because I think if there's one place in the world that has been historically so ahead of its time, it's here. It's your university. And so having this ability of being so humble to ask for a politician from Europe to come and talk about something that you are so good at, I just thought was pretty unique, and I thank you for that. And this morning when you told me the story of Andrew Carnegie, that in the 1900s came out and said, here it is, $1 million for the creation of this technical institute in Pittsburgh at the time. I was struck by the fact that you told that these men in the 1900s wanted to create a place where working class men and women could learn practical skills to enhance their careers, lives in the community of Pittsburgh. And when you told me that, I thought about the amazing German philosopher Goethe, that used to say that knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. And today, what I've seen here is exactly that. You are a place where you apply, where you do, and that it's very inspiring. And Carnegie felt at the time that the skills needed to tackle the huge jump of technological development were not available. And it's funny because today we are at the same crossroads. The difference is that it's not the 1900s. We are in 2017. And so the question is, how do you prepare yourself for a future that you don't know? A future that sometimes is defined by politicians that don't know that future. Politicians that do legislation that is based on something that they don't know. What will be the role of universities? Will they be at the center of that educational system? What kind of system do we have? But before diving into the subject, let me probably frame it and give you some background on what's going on in the European Union today. We are facing one of the biggest crises since the Second World War. Terrorism, refugees, the financial crisis, Brexit, you name it. And all those crises came at the same time. And when you think about it, it's quite amazing that the European Union survived all these crises. Crises that you never seen before. But at the same time, it's puzzling that people are discussing if Europe should stay united or not in such a time. Because at the end of the day, you look at the world and you think, the European Union, what's the European Union? The European Union today represents 20% of the GDP of the world. 30 years ago was more than 30%, as the US was, and today is not. China, 30 years ago, was 2% of the GDP, and today is almost 17% of the GDP of the world. And in 30 years, what it will be? You know, in 30 years, there will be no country of the European Union alone that will be part of the G7. So in the 7 major economies of the world in 30 years, there will be no European country. Germany will represent 1% of the population and will probably be the 9th economy in the world. So people are discussing something that is quite weird. Do we want to have a place at the table or not? That's the real discussion. But people get scared. People get scared because you're getting smaller and your influence is not what it used to be. And when people get scared, normally they take the wrong decisions, they actually get to the wrong conclusions. Enrico Letta was the Prime Minister of Italy a couple of years ago, and he used to say that in Europe there's two types of countries. The small ones, and the ones that didn't realize yet that they are small. And I think it's such really a point that we have to think for the future. There's nothing we can do alone. And science is such a great example of that. I always tell the example when you look at Einstein, that alone in 1910, 1915, wrote a paper by himself, actually several, 4 or 5, papers that changed the world. Last year when we actually got the gravitational waves and we got the paper, there was more than 1,000 authors of that paper from very different countries. So, you know, what can we do today alone? But the discussion, it's strange because the discussion is about something that does not exist anymore. You know, the discussion in the world today is a lot about sovereignty. Are we sovereign? Are we sovereign of our people? Is our country sovereign? Are we protected from others? And then you think, but what's that sovereignty? And people still think about that sovereignty as it was described in the 1600s by Jean Baudin. Jean Baudin used to say that sovereignty was about the right to collect taxes, the right to declare war, and the right to print money. But are you sovereign today if you cannot cope to pay the salaries of your public servants, if you cannot provide health for your people? You're not sovereign. So sovereignty is not anymore about the right of. Because the problems are not problems of one country. If you talk about cybersecurity, climate change, food production, or health, those problems are not the problem of one country. Richard Haas says that what goes inside of a country can no longer be considered the concern of that country alone. And so the concept of sovereignty itself changed from a right to an obligation. And that's something that, you know, you always think for these 400 years after the Peace of Westphalia, you think about sovereignty as something that is the right of a physical border, of protect yourself, and today it's not anymore. It's a sovereign obligation. If my neighbor is not doing the right thing, what can I do? Does my neighbor has the right to do things that create a negative externality on my economy? That's what sovereign is about, is my obligation to others and not the obligation of others to me. So my point to you today is that if you want to maintain your sovereignty, you can only do it by opening, not by closing. You can only do it through diversity of ideas and experiences. And that's why when we started 2 years ago, this amazing journey of looking at science and innovation in Europe, we decided that our motto, our vision would be what we call the 3 O's: open innovation, open science, and openness to the world. And you know, at the time it was such a technical thing for me. I had the chance to be the student of Henry Chesbrough, the creator of the so-called open innovation. And so for me it was like a technical thing. Open innovation as the base of innovation, open science because I thought about open data, about open access to publications, and then openness to the world. And it became today a quasi-political statement. But it is not political. It's technical. And when you look, the other day I was with the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, and he was telling the story in a way that I think I would like to share with you because it relates to my home country, to Portugal. If you go 600 years back and you look at the world, you saw that China was well ahead of everybody with the Ming Emperor. In the 15th century, the Chinese decided that they will discover the world. And you know what? They get this Admiral Zheng He, and Zheng He built an army of 28,000 people. They built the biggest boats and the biggest ships ever. Ships that could not have been built in Europe at the time. And they went and explored the oceans. They went to Southeast Asia. They reached Persia, the Indian Ocean, Africa, the Middle East. And they discovered the world. But suddenly the mood in the court changed. And the idea grew that the world was a dangerous place. That foreign ideas could be a threat to the way of life of China. And so protectionism became the norm, the way forward. And the Portuguese stepped up and they discovered the world. They changed Europe. They changed history. But the Chinese state closed for more than 400 years. And that, I think, is so clear that any time we have tried protectionism, everyone lost. We lost economic power. We lose everything by protectionism, but we still believe that protectionism somehow can kind of protect us. But it doesn't. It actually damages us. And then you go and you ask me another examples of protectionism, and you go to the First World War, and the First World War was about protectionism. What happens? The GDP of Europe went down by 14% after the First World War. And then it came the Second World War with the atrocity of the Second World War, and another time we decided that protectionism could be good, and the GDP of Europe went down by 22%. So those are the numbers of trying to close yourself in a world that you think that by closing you can protect yourself. So the answer has to be openness. The answer has to actually be to be able to explain to people why openness is so important. And that's why I think that what has failed in the last 20 years is that we were not able to explain to people why openness was good. And the reason is that because there was two camps. One camp that said that globalization was wonderful, and another camp that said that globalization was wrong. But globalization is a reality. It's not bad, not good. It's a fact of life. And globalization definitely took a lot of people out of poverty. More than 1 billion people were taken out of poverty by globalization. The very poor became somehow less poor, but the very rich became extremely rich. And the others in the Western world became poorer. Branko Milanovic at Harvard designed the so-called elephant chart, where you immediately see who actually didn't make it with the globalization. It was the people of the developed countries. And that's why we are so upset. That's why our people are upset, because they were sold something that was not true. Because that growth was uneven. The growth of productivity was not divided equally by people. It created inequality. And so we have to face that and think about it. In the last 20 years, if you look at that productivity, which is what creates wealth and jobs and changes the life of people, you see that in the last 20 years, the very good firms, the very good companies, grew that productivity by 3 to 5% a year. 3% in manufacturing, 5% in services. But the average company stagnated. So imagine for 20 years, these are numbers of the OECD, you got the very good ones, the few, growing, and the others stagnated. This creates a huge inequality. The top 10 firms of the OECD countries are 3 times more productive than the bottom 10%. So the economists of the OECD say that the diffusion mechanism is broken. And the other day, for the first time, the Central Bank of Europe did this conference about innovation. And Mario Draghi, for the first time, was talking about it. And he said, innovation is the sum of new ideas plus the diffusion of those ideas. if you don't trickle down those ideas, there's no productivity. So productivity growth depends not just on the new ideas, but on the diffusion of those ideas. And that diffusion mechanism got broken in the last 20 years. And the question is why? And I think that the answer comes to innovation and comes to the fact that the digital world has changed the way we innovate. The innovation that was just a matter of the producer became a matter of the user. Eric von Hippel on user innovation. That before, the innovation was still at the core of disciplines, and today it happens at the intersections. Something that you understand very well here at Carnegie Mellon. But when you look at the reasons, and probably like as an engineer that has been an economist also for a long time, if you look at the work of Draghi at the European Central Bank and Dan Roderick at Harvard, you ask the question, why is this mechanism broken? Why is this diffusion in terms of demand and supply? What happens? And so if you look at the demand side, what you see is that the digital world is still limited to a very small part of our economy. And when you talk to conferences and people come to me, people tell me, no, that's not true. I mean, the world is digitalized. And it's not. I mean, just 10% of our economy is digitalized. Our small and medium companies in Europe, they're not digitalized. They're not yet in the digital world. But the reality is that most of us, we spend our income in education, in health, in real estate, in government, and those are not yet digitalized. So on the demand side, I think that the constraint for the diffusion is actually quite okay because we are just at the tipping point of that happening. So we just have to wait. That will happen by definition. The third wave of the internet, as Steve Case calls it, is exactly that, is the internet coming into our lives, into our everyday lives. But if you look at the difference between the US and the EU, it's very interesting to see that, is that if you look at the gap of the productivity from 1995 to 2007, that difference is just the better adoption of ICT, of technology, in the US vis-à-vis Europe. So if I break down productivity, I'll see that there's no difference on the non-ICT or the non-digital companies in Europe, that the total factor productivity is quite similar. But then the adoption of that technology by companies is what makes that gap in between the US and the EU. But that, I think, it's the good part or the good side of the news. But then we have constraints on the supply side of the economy. What are those constraints of the supply side of the economy for that diffusion to happen? I think there are three: skills, disruptive ideas, and capital. Let's start by the skills, because I think that, I mean, I've seen so much today, and I had the pleasure to be listening to this very impressive group of people describing the Simon Initiative. And I came to my numbers, and I was just redrafting what I had to say before coming about Europe. And in Europe, we did a survey about skills where the answers were quite puzzling. The first is that 40% of the European employers, they say that they cannot find people with the right skills. So 40% of the employers say, we don't find the people. And 40% of the employees think that their skills will be obsolete in the next 5 years. So there must be something wrong that we're doing. There must be something that we're not working well. And when I look at my friends and I look at my personal experience coming from a country that went through a huge crisis, where everybody had someone in the family that was unemployed, what you see is that the countries that do well are the countries that understood that education is not just go to university, is a lifelong experience. It's about creating bridges in between learning and your job. And if you look at the countries in Europe that have the lowest numbers in terms of unemployment, like the Netherlands, what they did was exactly that. is that you never stop learning. You go from the university to the job, and 3 years later you come to the university, and then you go to the job, and you go, and you come back, and you go, and you come back. And so the point is, how do you do the matching of people's skills in real time? Because if I lose my job, how can I immediately get reskilled for my next job? And that, I think, is the big challenge for the future. And it's painful because, you know, if you are a university professor, you just want to do your job. You want to keep doing what you did, what it's comfortable to do. But today you have to prepare these kids and these people for the jobs of the future, jobs that you don't even imagine. And so I thought about just telling about 2 experiences I had very recently in terms of education. You know, one of the things I've learned in this job is that excellence is everywhere. You find amazing places everywhere. And I travel, I mean, I have to go to 28 countries, and then I have to go abroad, and I have to tell the story of Europe. And sometimes people ask me, but you know, when you say that your science program is just about excellence, do you think that's good for countries that are not yet excellent? And I say, you know, what I see is that countries always have niches of excellence. And so I went to Armenia not long ago, where I found the best project of education that I've seen. It's a place called TUMO, T-U-M-O. And TUMO is an after-school program created by 2 American-Armenian a couple. And they just built this amazing place where kids go after school. So it's impressive. You see 800 kids just waiting for their turn. It's free. And what they do is that they get kids over there, and the kids, they just go through a session where they create their own journey based on the things that they like. And so at the end, they don't have a diploma. They have a portfolio of things that they did and they know how to do. And the most impressive thing is that a lot of those kids go there thinking that what they like is science, and they come out of there actually as music composers. And some of them discover things that they are so passionate about that because they are so passionate, they are afraid of their passion. And so this idea of these American-Armenian couple of getting these liberating kids from the fear of their passions, it's something that is amazingly inspiring. And so you have these kids that at the end they create companies, some of them become musicians, some of them became artists in different ways, and some of them entrepreneurs. And you see this in Yerevan, in Armenia. I would love my kids to go there. And you know, it's quite puzzling to think that today you can create these projects wherever you are, if you're really passionate about it and if you want to do it. The other project that I think is very relevant for our conversation today is a project developed in France called 42. And 42 was developed by a French entrepreneur called Xavier Niel. And he basically said to himself, I cannot get enough of really more people that know to anything about IT. I can't get them from the university, I can't get them from schools, so I need developers. And so he decided to create his own school. It's a school called 42. It's the first computer training course that is entirely free. It's open to all. And 42, like TUMO, they have something in common, is that it's not about the teachers, it's not about the classes. They design their own journey, and that I think is something that we'll really have to reflect for the future. And I was discussing this morning with Debbie around the corner, and she was making a wonderful visit. And she was telling me about the fact that people here, they come to Carnegie Mellon exactly because of that. because they can do music and at the same time they can do computer science. And that is a huge strength for you. So I think that those are the examples that show that education in the future will not be just about universities. The universities will be a piece of the puzzle. It will be about the networks that you will create in life, that you have to develop in different areas and in different parts of your life. And I think that that's something that today we're still very ingrained is a top-down approach that we have our life, the secondary education, and then the university, and then we go to a job. And that's something that we don't want to actually to stop because we are afraid. We are too comfortable in our own system. The second point that I just wanted to go very quickly, and I know I have 5 minutes, is about disruptive ideas. And here I wanted just to tell 2 quick points about disruptive ideas. The first is about a great example of an European experience in Finland. The Finnish government decided last year, and imagine, Finland is a great country with a great education system. It's a small country in size, but it's an amazing country of innovation. And they decided that the kids in the secondary school should actually change, that they should not just have disciplines, math, geography, you name it. So they decided that half of the time should be not organized around disciplines, but organized around events. And so they will have like World War II. We'll see it in an angle of sociology, mathematics, geography, arts. And then the kids will get used to be in an environment that is interdisciplinary. And so when we do our programs of science and say, no, you have to collaborate, you have to be together, you have to work with a guy from anthropology, with a guy from computer science, if they never met, they will not do it. They will fake it. And that's not good. And so I think that having a country like Finland making such a difference, changing all the education system, I think this is a case study that you should follow, that we all should follow, and that we should see the results. And I think that the disruptive ideas really come from that intersection. And the other day, just very quickly, I was meeting this guy who is an amazing guy called Bertrand Piccard. Bertrand Piccard is a Swiss guy, and he decided to create a solar plane. So a plane that is moved by solar energy. And he decided to go around the world with that plane. But before, when he had the idea, he went to all the airplane constructors. And he said, I want to build a plane without fuel, solar, and I want to go around the world. And all the airplane constructors told him, that's impossible. It's going to be too heavy, too big. How can you do these solar panels in a plane? That's impossible. We don't do it. You have no chance. Go away. And what he did is that he basically went to see a friend who was a boat builder. And the boat builder did it. And I asked him, why was that? And he said, first, the boat builder didn't know it was impossible. But I think that the boat builder really have another angle than the airplane constructor. And I think that that's where I see the importance of your work here, Subra. I think that the example that you're giving to the world about Carnegie Mellon being this intersection of disciplines is something that I have never seen some in other places, and I think that is an amazing example. So I think that in terms of these disruptive ideas, I think that it's how you'll get around it. And finally, I wanted just to have a word on the final part, which is what's the other part of the ecosystem that's not working for this diffusion. And we talked about the disruptive ideas and the intersections and how we have to change the education. But without capital, we can't do it. And today we have a problem with capital, is that there's too little. It's a capital that wants to go too fast, and it's too greedy. And so one of the things that we're trying to change in Europe is about how we can get patient capital, capital that can wait for technology, And today I was just with one of you talking about computer science and talking about how long does it take. Sometimes things that we're developing today, I was talking about batteries with Jay, and I don't know if Jay is here, and he's telling me that it takes 10 years, 20 years. So you have to have investors that believe in patient capital. But more than that, you have to have investors that believe in purpose. And I think that when 100 years ago, investors focused on return, and then it came the Great Depression, and investors became also worried about risk and the balance in between risk and return. I think that this century will be about investors that will believe that you can generate financial return while enabling societal benefits, driving both profits and purpose. And I think that that's something that we really have to reflect as a society. Do we want just to invest for profit, or do we want to invest for purpose? And when you look at the numbers, you see that by 2020, you will have a lot of people, because the new generation wants to invest for purpose. And so we have to create those conditions. So let me conclude by saying that the reality is that we can get all this right. We can remove all the supply and demand barriers, and there is a strong voice already calling for change in how our education system works, but we need to act on it. We need to strive to digitize, improve venture capital, encourage disruptive innovation, and shift how we see education. Only then we will rebalance productivity. And I want to end my lecture this evening quoting a man you all know very well, Abraham Lincoln. And in 1862, when he addressed Congress, he said, and I quote, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." Ladies and gentlemen, if we are to overcome what is facing us, if we are to survive in a globalized world, we must do exactly this: think anew and act anew. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos, for a very thought-provoking lecture. I just want to say two things. In 2011, I had the pleasure of having dinner with Bertrand Piccard and his Turkish-born wife in Lausanne. And in addition to approaching the boat builder, he told me that there are two other things that he really needs to train for. One is, for every 10 minutes or so of flying, he had to train his body and his mind to take a nap for a minute or so while he was flying across the Pacific Ocean. The second is to learn to control his bladder, because he cannot get out of that small cabin. So it was a remarkable feat, and recently he did create a world record for this. The second point with respect to openness, especially in the job that you do so well, and also Jean-Pierre's position at the European Research Council, the idea of openness at a time of focusing inward. In 2012 at the National Science Foundation, when under the sponsorship of the White House and with a lot of help from the European Commission and the European Research Council, when we launched the Global Research Council, Science magazine approached me to write an editorial, and they said, if you were to say one sentence on science and openness, what that sentence will be, which was the opening to my editorial. And it's very hard to come up with one sentence. It's much easier to come up with a couple of pages. The only thing I could think of, which sort of is consistent with the theme of your lecture, is good science anywhere is good for science everywhere. So that's my addition to your speech. Thank you very much. I have a as a very small, being a government official, he cannot accept elaborate gifts. Not that we are used to giving elaborate gifts, but in being fully respectful of your constraints, we have a very typical Carnegie Mellon gift, which we will open at your pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to invite Carlos to join the panel along with Amy so that we have an opportunity for a few questions. and
Very good,
thoughts.
Soha. Very
Please.
good.
Have sit.
Perfect.
Well, thank you, Commissioner, for a very inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. As the event team gets ready for questions from the audience, as a biologist, I really enjoyed the diffusion metaphor. I also really like the 3 O's that you brought up. And one of the questions that we have been struggling with in a variety of groups on campus is, how do we add that 4th O? How do we help our students who are in this environment where there are all of these opportunities be open to have their minds open and their hearts open in a way that would engage this future? I think that sometimes they come in with a very tunneled vision, thinking of what is today and not so much what is tomorrow. And they have a very singular focus. And so as educators, we're trying to think about, how do we broaden them to these other skill sets? What evidence or arguments would you offer to our students here today and watching on the live stream to think about, how do they add that 4th O, opening their minds and their hearts to these broader skills and opportunities?
I think that students, they come to university very influenced by their parents. And their parents, I'm sorry for the parents in the room, they're not good advice. Because parents are, by definition, very risk averse. And they want their kids to go to a planned career and do something that is safe. And each time I feel the same with my kids. If they come with something a little bit out of the box, I'm afraid for them because I don't want them to suffer. And I think that when you get to university, you kind of have to liberate yourself of that sometimes family pressure, your own peer pressure, and you should just think about, what do I really enjoy? And you know, I spent a long time of my life looking for that. I was first a civil engineer in a construction company, and then after 5 years I didn't like it. And then I went to an MBA, and then I went to banking, and I was a very unhappy banker. And even if Subra introduced, is there happy bankers? And you know, I think that sometimes we kind of follow always, and it's very dangerous, especially in places like these, because it's such an amazing place, such a very good university, that you really want to follow the herd. You want to do what others do. So if the good students do something and you're a good student, you follow them. And I think is a very inner exercise of liberating yourself from people around you and thinking, what do I want to do? And it's much easier said than done. But at the end, when you find that, you do something and you feel happy every day. And when you don't feel happy every day, that's because there's a problem. So I think it's an exercise that we have to do with ourselves. Is a very personal thing. And I think society in general puts you so much borders and constraints and ideas, and so it's something that you have to work with yourself first, and then you make the right choices or not. And sometimes you do the wrong choices, but that's good. It's also good to do those wrong choices at some point in your life.
Terrific. Are there questions from the audience? Volker?
I would like to build on what Amy's question was and your response. And we are really very, very committed to reach across boundaries. And we want to address the Simon principles. And the point is, when kids come with all kinds of prejudice from their parents or whatever, but they come from different locations, different countries, and different perspectives. But when they're together, they could learn from each other. And so my question is, how could we make freshman dormitory the experience that they would see how that relates to energy, the environment, human health, on all the sciences and so on, physically, to practice what we teach? That's my question.
That's a difficult one. It's a very difficult one. It's a very difficult question. Because I think that you have this unique, and I've studied here in the U.S., and I think that the beauty of this country is that you really have people that come from all over the world. And you get those people from all over the world in the same place. And so that's something that is so unique because, you know, the diversity, the attraction that you have, and you get all these people. And then it's difficult. You know, my best professor, or one of my best professors, is a woman called Linda Hill at the Harvard Business School. She's a professor of organizational behavior. And she has been studying diversity for more than 20 years. And she always told us, like, diversity hurts. Diversity creates pain. And sometimes it doesn't work. But when it works much better than anything else. And so I think that when you're a freshman and you come, and I was also here in this country as someone coming from Portugal, you know, come to a big country like the United States, and people just, you feel somehow lonely because you come from such a different culture. But then if people really get you into group exercises, that you get them together, not just in the classroom, but outside of the classroom, you can get really a lot out of it. But I think that sometimes we think that everything happens in the classroom, and I think that nothing happens in the classroom. Everything happens outside of the classroom. I'm exaggerating, of course, and because I love to be in the classroom. But it's outside of the class. And so how do you engage with that? And the first year is extremely difficult because you can feel very lonely. So you have to be watching for them very much, and to put them together. But I think that, I mean, it is not good advice that I can give you. I'm sure that you know more than I do about it. But it's about getting people together outside of the classroom. It's about teaching them that even if you don't think the same way, it's not bad, it's good. That you have to respect the other's ideas, and it's good to have different opinions. And in some cultures, you feel a little bit more anxious if you say something that others don't agree. So you have to work that out. But I think that it's something that in 90% of the cases works. 10% it doesn't, but it has to get a lot of work from the teachers and the professors to be watching the kids all the time, and it's something that you have to work out.
Thank you. Another question?
Hi, my name is Ben Town. Thank you very much for coming out. This Saturday, myself and perhaps a few 100,000 colleagues will be attempting to make the point that science should have some impact on policy, and that it might be useful to make our policy decisions more informed by science. And you're right at that intersection of science and policy. And so I was wondering if you could perhaps concisely summarize why science is important in policy making from your perspective.
That's first of all, I will also be marching for science in my home town of Lisbon this Saturday. And I'll do it as a person, not as a government person or a politician. So I'll be there with some friends in Lisbon. And I think that is important to do so for several reasons. First, I wanted to tell you why do I think it's important to march for science. I think that scientists should be more vocal about what they do. They should be more somehow a little bit more bullish than they are about the importance of science. You sometimes stay with your friends, and everybody is a scientist and a researcher, and you're okay, but you have to fight for it. And I think that the importance of that today is enormous, because you're living in a time that people don't believe anymore that science is important for policy. A lot of people think that, and I think that it's wrong, and it has been proven wrong. Science is extremely important. The problem is that you have to create the conditions of putting science as an input to policy without thinking that that science will be the only input for policy. And so science is an input for policy. And politicians, a lot of times they can choose not to follow the scientific advice, but they have to have it. And scientists have to be aware that policy making is not just about science, it's also about voters, it's about feelings, it's about more than that. But you have to have the evidence. And I think that one of the things we have developed this year in Europe is this idea. We have 7 chief scientific advisors that before we put something into law, they give us science advice, they give us the evidence for that legislative proposals. And I think that the problem today is that when you have a discussion on things that you have a very different set of values, science cannot help you. So if I have in this room a discussion about a subject where our set of values is common, and if I put more evidence and more science on it, we will achieve a better conclusion. If I'm talking about subjects where our set of values are different, then each time I put more science on top, people will counter-argue with different arguments, and it will be a non-stop story. And I think that today in the world, when you look at subjects like GMOs or other subjects that have been transformed in political subjects, it's exactly because of that, because you have such a set of values that are so different that science will not solve it. But science can give us more options. And I think the scientific advice that I believe is a scientific advice where the scientist is not advocating, but is putting more options on the table. And you've seen that even when you have different sets of values, if you give more options, people follow those options. And so I see the scientific advice as putting options on the table. It's extremely, I think that today more than ever is important to inform politicians about that scientific advice, but not telling them what to do. I think people are tired of facts. People want to understand the process. And what you saw in scientists sometimes is that scientists come to politicians and say, this is the fact, do this. But today people are tired of that. They want to understand the process of science. And so how do you explain to politicians, this is the process of science, this is what we do. We don't know everything. There's some things we know and some things we don't know. The inferential gap is the difference between that. But I think that it's about informing the policymakers about the process, to give them information and options. And that's, I think, is the future, because it's not anymore enough just to tell them what to do. Nobody wants anymore to be told.
Thank you. Another question?
Hi, thanks for speaking. I'm Nikhil. There's a certain irony in this question. It's not directed at you, but the other 2 people on the stage, actually. But I want to hear you speak, actually. So how do we convince school administration that the experiences outside of the classroom are valuable? And how do they then translate that to things that we actually do in the classroom and give us that space to actually have those experiences outside of the classroom?
So maybe I'll
Yep.
take that up. This is exactly why of the 3 strategic priorities for the university that has come up from the students and faculty for the next 10 years is enriching the CMU experience. And that has very little to do just with the classroom, and it has a lot to do with outside of the classroom. You are exactly right. I think that's one of the reasons, and it goes back to the question, I think Volker's question about what kind of experience do we want to give, what do you learn outside of the classroom, and how it makes you a much better learned individual. So that's something that we can do. So specifically, what do administrators do? Raise a lot of resources, build infrastructure, provide support structures, provide services to enrich that experience. So that's a tangible example of the learning outside of the classroom, how it can impact university experience entails.
I would also say that I actually feel like I made that my opening remark to say that things like this forum, where there are dialogues and discussions, are one of the ways that we can enrich the life of the mind beyond just assignments and within the classroom. I do also think you don't have to convince many of us, because there's a strong commitment to undergraduate research, to study abroad. I would say it maps back to, in some ways, the resources, but also having students open to look for and engage. And there are some students who totally engage, but there are some who are very much not seeing these opportunities. So advising and other support mechanisms to make sure that all of our students are getting access and are knowledgeable of making informed choices. I think it all makes a loop in terms of the topics of the discussion.
No, I think that is. I think that your point about that is also about you, and sometimes students don't engage, and I think that it's not just the school. The school is you, and it's about what you do in the school to help also, because I think it's a kind of a peer-to-peer. There's the professors, but also the students. And I think that I always felt that universities like this one have an amazing ability to do that. And so you're really at one of the best places in the world for that to happen. And so if it doesn't happen, you have to think also what you can do as a person and as a student to engage more into that. So I totally agree with your point. But it's always about yourself thinking, which is difficult. When you are studying at university, you want to do well, you want to go and go to the classroom and do your exams and pass, and you have the responsibility that is expensive and you're paying. But at the same time, that prevents you to think out of the box and to think, I would love to go back to university, because I think my experience, sometimes like 10 years later, 20 years later, you think I would have enjoyed much more. But at the time, I didn't understand what was important. So I was kind of running around for everything because I thought everything was important. And so it's about making those choices, what is important in a big picture. And I know it's difficult, so it's not an easy exercise, but it's about sometimes at the end of the day, go to your room and write the 2-3 things of the day that you think are important, and then think about it, and the next day you do it again. I believe that it's sometimes to really have a moment doing that. I think it's very important, even when you're a very busy person. I always take 1 hour where I close everything. I don't have my phone, I don't have the computer, just think about my day and my next day. And students at university, because you're running around and you're young, you don't do that. And so if I could have an advice, would be that for you, the younger ones in the room.
I think for the final question, I will ask you that this summer in Berlin, Germany, actually will be the 3rd Global Learning Council Summit, the group that is part of the Simon Initiative, and Subra leads that group. And one of the themes of that conference will be looking at the future work and the needs and skills that will be on focus that we need to prepare our students for that future. And I'm curious if you would be able to advise that group, what are some of those core skills you talked about that employers in Europe are saying they're not finding in the educated populace coming forward?
That's a very difficult question, but it's an interesting one. I've been reading a Swedish sociologist called Kjell Nostrum, and he wrote a book called The Urban Express that explains why cities are becoming really the centers of everything. I mean, so you basically have 600 cities in the world that produce more than 80% of the GDP of the world. And why is that? Why cities became the hubs of innovation and discovery? And one of the things that I think that will always differentiate us, and so these Swedish man went back to the work of the economist Polanyi in the 50s, was about the fact that you really have two types of knowledge. You have knowledge that you can digitize, and that everything that you can digitize you will. But then there's knowledge, tacit knowledge, that you cannot verbalize. And that tacit knowledge, it's something that you can just learning by the experience of being with people around you. It's those things that you don't say, but they are those facts that make you that you become good at your job. It's because you had that contact, that experience with a person. So I'm a believer that a part of what you do will be online and a part of education will be online, but a big part of it has to be the experience. And so there's always a part of it that we'll never be able to digitize. And I think those skills that you cannot digitize are the ones of the future, because all the rest you will.
Well, please join me in thanking Commissioner Moedas. I do want to say that Subra did pick the exact perfect person to kick off this series. You covered a wide range of topics and gave us a lot to think about and to act upon. So hopefully we will do and learn as you have shared with us today. Thank you.